So afternoon, this is the one of the other non-Joomla sections today to get a little educated in some other stuff, I guess, that I was asked to present on Angular. Anybody here actually work with Angular yet or read about it much? Good, okay. How many of you are JavaScript developers maybe? Any JavaScript ninjas in the house? Ninjas, okay. All right, so you don't necessarily have to be to get started with Angular, but you're going to do some more advanced stuff in anything in the web. You got to know how to do JavaScript. So, my name is Douglas Knudsen. I'm a local Atlanta guy, not a native, but a local Atlanta guy. And we were just talking. I'm definitely a Gator fan. I'm hoping they win today. Yeah. Got some email and information there. Of course, a Twitter handle because everybody has to have one of those. And of course, I have a blog there that I occasionally visit myself. But you know, a blog's gotten up and down, reading them and getting to them. So I currently work with a company called Universal Mind. We're a digital service agency. We service pretty much across all business verticals, doing applications from desktop web, mobile web, responsive web, to native Android and iOS applications. And to be honest, I'm currently working in native Android, so if I mess up and say anything in Java instead of JavaScript today, that's probably why. If you happen to be a JavaScript ninja, please talk to me after. We're always looking for people. If you're an Angular massive ninja, then definitely talk to me. We're always looking for people. So we're going to start off simple agenda. I'm really just going to try to cover some philosophy slides and talk about what Angular is really targeting. So you get a good introduction, understanding what it's for, where you're going to use it. You can take it back to your boardroom or take it back to your manager and start jamming on it. Going to haul through a bunch of features and quick samples. I'm a developer, so I like to show code. I'm going to try to stay with showing code in the slides, though, so you can take the slides with you pretty easy. And if we don't run out of time, there's a list of resources at the end that I'm going to talk about a little bit. So, to begin, we got to talk about what actually Angular is going to target and what kind of application you actually write with Angular. And that is what is these new things called single page applications. Anybody heard this term already? Yeah. Right? It's been a pretty modern term. Kind of came out of the Flash world days where they started having a single application in one web page that did all the stuff and drag and drop. And then HTML said, hey, I got to do that now. And they finally caught up and then kicked Flash to the curb. These are also known as SPAs. And a big deal is that where this used to have a bunch of arrows going from the front to back, cut the arrows out and put in a fuzzy little line there. And we do all the work over here, and every once in a while we say, hey, you data, those big iron guys back there, give me the data I need. You know, every once in a while we shoot some data back to it. Otherwise we do all the work over here. So we got to do our UI, our app layer in JavaScript, data layer in JavaScript, or even local storage, what do we need to do over here? And it actually ended up using a lot of business logic over here now, right? So that's what Angular is for. It's designed to actually make developing these easier. If you're going to develop a single website that's just one page at a time flopping around, Angular is pretty much overkill. You don't need any framework really. Just need jQuery. UI is declarative. Business logic is imperative. Their approach is that we're going to make the UI declarative in how we lay it out. We're not going to use JavaScript to lay out and build stuff. We're going to use JavaScript only for business logic, POJOs, plain old JavaScript objects that kind of hijack that term. It's a framework. It's not a library, not a widget library. It's opinionated. Some developers don't like this. But when you get a large group of developers, maybe a senior tech architect and a group of junior developers, sometimes having opinionated a framework is actually good to help make sure everything keeps going along. At least that's my opinion, and I guess I'm opinionated on that. So it's going to tell you, you're going to have to follow what the framework is, the way it's set up, and the tool set, and use it the way it's built. This is opposed to something like Backbone, which says, hey, here's some stuff, go have at it. You want to use a pattern, go ahead. If you want to use an anti-pattern, go ahead. If you want to make spaghetti, go ahead. Angular is the opposite. It actually tries to put some controls in place that forces you to use those patterns. It's an MVVM, or otherwise known as MV star architecture. So in other words, it is MV controller, MVC, but we use VM instead, view model, which is basically just a tweak on the MVP, right? Model, view, presenter model. Testable. The guys involved in developing Angular from Google are testing fanatics. They love testing. They are living the life of, the example life of TDD, that goal that like none of us ever reach, because we have work to do sometimes. So they actually have, the whole framework is set up, they run tests on it, whole set of tests. They've built a tool called Karma, and renamed to Karma, it's a nice name now, that actually runs full end-to-end testing and everything on browsers in a headless way. So it actually, from a command prompt, will run tests on your website and your application completely in all different browsers. There's no API to inherit, but it does have a utility belt like underscore, right? It has the same kind of thing like underscore. Things to loop, make looping easier, string manipulation easier, stuff like that. But you don't have to actually use underscore. It's already built in the framework. Another approach is they're going to extend HTML at will for behavior. If you want a superstar tag, an element in your HTML, Angular gives you the tools to build that tag. It's open source. These guys at Google are really big on open source. They really like the whole idea, just like earlier we heard from Jason on Mozilla, the same kind of approach, right? All the sources out on GitHub project. You can pull it, fork it, do what you want with it. Even better, you can fix it, you can add to it, put in a PR, and work with the Google team. They want to decouple DOM manipulation from application logic. The authors saw that in a lot of cases, big applications are built, people are doing things like having a quick response handler way down in the bottom of some page, run a jQuery, bunch of stuff that manipulates DOM way up here in different areas. You shouldn't be doing that. It's not enough layers in between in your architecture to make things reusable, portable, and testable. So they decouple that. The declarative UI approach and this decoupling and the MVC practice, of course, actually help your design developer workflow. Because the approach is, again, to use declarative markup for your UI. You can hand it off to a designer and hand it back to a developer in a much more seamless fashion. It'll never be seamless because it's like a last mile thing in development that'll be forever in front of us. There's no boilerplate. It has a small set of tools, a little bit what you need. You go to town on it and you do it. You don't have to, if you want to build a new piece of UI, you don't have to fill out 6 different classes along the way that satisfy all this stuff like typically happens in Backbone. Fairly academic approach. These guys that are involved in writing it, Misko and Adam at Google, they are like PhD guys, right? They sit around with people that are that academic level all the time. So the framework has a lot of patterns to follow, design patterns. Uses everything in the book. You'll notice that lots. You're going to get used to that. So, without further ado, why don't we look at some code? This is, of course, hello world. We got to do hello world, right? In everything you learn, you got to do hello world first. So, if we look up, and I don't have a laser pointer, but up there, well, for one, it just looks like a regular web page. And I'm going to get to this at the end. The reason it looks like a regular web page is because it's a simple example in one slide. I don't want to have 6 slides to do the same thing. So we, of course, pull in the Angular library. And the biggest attention to look at is right on the first div, the only div. There's this little attribute, ng-app. And I give it a name. What this does is tell Angular, hey, I'm going to start my application right here at that div, in that scope on my DOM. I'm going to start my application. And Angular says, okay, cool. We're going to start your application there. We're going to build a root scope. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you how it's going to bootstrap stuff in there. I'm going to give it a controller that says that, hey, this element that it's sitting in, I want it to be wired to this controller, this JavaScript controller. and it'll pass scope for you so you can handle managing what's inside of the div. Right below that, you'll see the double curly braces, right? That is the magic binding we're going to get to a little later, called two-way binding, which will win you over in every boardroom in the US, right? What that basically says is, hey, whatever the message property is, evaluate it, run toString on it, and spit it out there. So when you actually look in your inspector, web inspector tools, you'll see the actual there. You won't see the curly brace or whatever. It's actually run the toString on it, run it. Not only that, we'll talk later too, is the magic here is that if I change this property, it will automatically update here on its own. So that's a simple application, really quick and easy. Why don't we want to try this at work? Well, our controller, all this stuff here should be in a separate JavaScript file, right? Depending on the size of your application, you may have a multitude of controllers in functional areas. You may have one file with all your controllers in it. It all depends on how big your app is and how much you need there. The other thing to note is I mentioned scope. What is one of the biggest challenges working with JavaScript? Scope. You got to know what this is, right? That's the key. Everything gets messed up all the time if you don't know what this is. Well, like I said, it started scope off at that NGRoute. So this is like a root scope or root object scope that you're going to attach things to. And here I have attached a property directly to a root scope, which is probably not a good idea. Because later in my app, I might try adding a property in a subscope, and because of JavaScript's prototypical hierarchy and nature, the scope chain is going to get all messed up, and you might really screw up things. There's several issues that are open in GitHub for Angular, saying, hey, there's something wrong with scope, and it gets closed every time. Like, nope, you did this again. Nope, you did it again. So just an FYI. So what happens? When it initially kicks in, the web page gets loaded, our Angular JavaScript code is loaded, it listens for the constant loaded event, and at that point, it says, oh, I've got an Angular app here, I'm going to go try to find this NGApp element somewhere in the page. Parses the DOM, goes finds it, says, okay, I've got it, it's named module or whatever, so I'm going to give it a name so that you can reference it easy. And I'm going to start my root scope there, and I'm going to create an injector service. And then I'm going to go do a compile. And by compile, Angular is actually going through the whole DOM tree, finding all your elements that you've created in the Angular elements and hooking them up in their own DOM tree to take care of things. So that way you can actually have the scope and the binding and all that stuff happen. So this is all the bootstrap does. But basically, you know that this is actually old news, right? I did this like 15 years ago. If you take your HTML, somewhere in the HTML page, and you put a tag in, whatever you want to call it superstar. And after that's loaded, you take your JavaScript and you start parsing through the DOM and looking around, you'll find it. The browser ignored it. Most browsers, actually IE might choke. Imagine that. But you can find it. So even 15 years ago, we could do this. I was doing this in server-side cold fusion programming, where I needed something in the client. I could put my own element in a select tag and keep track of 3 extra things that the select tag couldn't do. If only I thought of building a framework at that time, it would have been better. But anyway, that's basically what it's doing. So some quick feature lists. We've been talking about this two-way data binding. Yep, it does go both ways. Templates. We're going to have a templating system, much like your handlebars, right? But it's going to be actually part of the Angular framework. Directives, and that's the real deal of Angular. This is where everything basically is built on directives. Filters, of course we have the filter data. Of course we got to do XHRs, and I'm going to mention dependency injection a little bit. Routing, we got to route. We're in a single page app. We can't just reload the page all the time. We got to handle how we're going to route through the app. And forms. Last but not least, forms, which the whole web is built on, right? If you're doing an application. So, how does two-way binding look like? It's basically this little model here. We have a view, and then we have a property on we're managing in the model, and anytime the view updates it, it automatically updates it in the model, and anytime the model updates, it automatically updates in the view. Obviously, it keeps track, so you don't get an infinite circle, which one's doing which one, but that's basically what happens. What's it look like in code? Basically similar to what we just saw, except instead of just only hello world being shown, we've got up here a input tag, right? Inside the input tag, I have this extra little bit of attribute that's part of Angular. Everything with NG on it is Angular, and it points to the model. What that says is whatever I type in there, stick it in my model inside that controller that's controlling that section, right? Right below that, I'm binding to it. So anytime it changes, it's going to re-update. Not only have I done this binding so that I'm seeing the binding go from the view to the model and back, we also have a default property here, so you can see how programmatically you actually start off. And without running any web thing, this is basically what it's going to do. And this is real time. You're typing automatically, boom, 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 right? You type whatever you want, it shows up. Normally it takes quite a bit of more code and writing observers and all this other stuff, right? If you're going to do this from raw JavaScript, it takes quite a bit. Templates. Templates are how we build the view up. They're written in HTML, of course, otherwise known as fragments, partials in some languages. In some frameworks, they call them partials. We call them that around here too. They can contain Angular expressions or elements. We can even do math inside of those expressions. A simple template right here. Span, we've already seen something basic like this, right? Span. No handlebars are needed, it's already built in. They can be inline or externalized. In other words, you can define templates or partials inside of a script tag inside your body of in your header or below or someplace in your app. And you simply include the template, or you make reference to it where you're going to be looping, as we're going to see in a minute. You can also store them in an actual file on the server, right? Or if you're doing a mobile app on a local device. Use them the same way. It doesn't matter where they're located, which way you put them, Angular will find it for you. We typically use these templates for repeatable UI areas. We want a list of data, right? We have this directive. I'm going to use this term a lot. Everything that you use functionality-wise uses a directive in Angular. NGRoute, which basically says repeat a section. And it literally will repeat and take this div here and make copies of it. Right? And for quick run through on this, says repeat person and people. So I have some collection of people, typically just some basic objects. And for each of those items called person, we can call it whatever we want because it's JavaScript, right? Person and people. Copy this thing over again and evaluate the bindings immediately. So there's a list of people. It's going to spell first name and last name, and a list of 10 people will be 10 rows. And it literally makes copies of this whole div. An example. As before, we have our NG app, NG controller. We said it would fall. And right under there, we have the repeat, like we just saw. Person and data.people. Here's my list of people. Simple JavaScript objects, right? I put a little extra in this example. Right after the person and people, there's a pipe, right? This is order by. Who can guess what that's doing? Order by last name, right? It's so easy to read. But it literally just order by, and you give it a property that's in your data, and it'll order by that property. I've also thrown a little extra bit, this ng class even. That is actually a directive that Angular provides us that says, hey, if I'm on the even row, add this class to this element. And it will literally, at runtime, inject that class into the list of classes in the class element, only for the even rows. And that's how you get the colorized rows. There's a whole slew of these things, ng odd, ng even, ng show, ng hide, different things like that. So we're going to take those templates one step further, and we're going to use them in directives where we're going to extend HTML for your own gain. This is where you manipulate the DOM. Very often it's jokingly heard that this is where you use jQuery, right? Because in a directive where you encapsulate actually manipulating the DOM and doing things, if you have to use jQuery, this is where you should be dropping it in, not anywhere else. You tell Angular here how to mix your view and your model. And like we said, we've already seen these directives so far. NGApp, NGModel. These little curly braces, that's actually a directive. It's called the interpolation directive. And you click and repeater, there's a list of them we'll see. They're all reusable. This is how you're going to build reusable code across your application or across your enterprise. You can share these. Here's a list of all the directives that come with the Angular framework. No, I'm not going to read them all. And nor are we going to cover them all, but it's a pretty good amount. And again, these give you all the tools where you do what you normally do from day to day. As soon as you work with a client, they're going to want to customize this or that. That's or what. You write your own directive, and you can use these directives inside there, of course. Something to point out, and we're going to talk about if we get to the form side at the end, look at the directives at the top. Those are HTML elements, right? It actually takes and adds those as directives so that it can listen in for form validation. On the anchor tag, it listens in so it can do the routing bits and things like that. How do we write a directive? Here's a very simple directive. Simple goal was to display the Angular badge. And I ended up displaying it twice because I have two examples of it actually displayed. Right up there in line 8 and 9 is where I'm displaying it. I've written my own HTML tag. Isn't that cool? I mean, that's really cool, right? You can kind of see where this is going because Google is actually trying to take over the world and making it possible with web components and stuff to actually write at a much lower level than JavaScript, write your own actual tags and stuff. So there's two different ways to set them up. One is called an element. The first one on line 8, and line 9 is actually using a attribute, right? In either case, I'm going to get the end result. Except that, like I mentioned earlier, the first example as an element, IE tends to choke on it. In further versions of Angular, there might not be a problem because they're totally throwing out support for old versions of IE, which is like, yes. What's an old version of IE, like 15? The future version. So, how did I actually write this guy? All right, this is a very simplistic directive. Doesn't do anything really crazy with using models, but I literally use a method that Angular exposed called directive to create one. I give it a name. And you'll notice the name is in camel case, but when you actually use it, you use it in hyphenated case. You pass it a function that's basically through the framework, it's able to use that and instantiate your directive on the fly. And in this case, I use a restrict AE. This tells Angular that says, I want this directive to be used as an attribute or an element. I could use also an M or a C in here. M for comments. You can actually make it an Angular directive that will execute inside of comments. The C would be in classes, so you can actually make your directive work inside of a class. Replace true means that, hey, when you execute this thing, replace whatever it's sitting in. As you can see, in result, there's only image tags here, right? It's replaced the div, and in the top one, it's just replaced the whole thing. And this is the template I'm going to use. Now, of course, you're going to do something that has data or some manipulation in here. So guess what? You can add a controller here, which will end up handing you scope. So then you can actually have data that you can pull off your parent scopes. You can also add your own properties to your directive. So I can pass in, so instead of just Angular image, maybe I could pass in alpha. So I can actually say, okay, not only do I want to support showing this image, I want to support being able to, the developer that's using it, to pass in an alpha value. And here you would actually add scope alpha, and you can grab that off of the tag and actually get that value and that property and use it to change the alpha or something using JavaScript. So these can get very, very, very advanced very quickly. The next level up, you can actually use something called a link function, which allows you to modify this template in your DOM stuff at runtime. And in an even more advanced version, you pass it what's called a compile function here, which allows you to modify all instances of the directive. So if you have an app that's using 10 instances of these, you can help modify all of those instead of just the individual instances. So again, this is what all of Angular is built on, this idea. For actually the UI end of it. Filters. Filters provide formatting, string literals. We all got to format things, right? So Angular is going to give us a pretty easy way to format numbers, dates, all that kind of stuff right in line pretty easily. Building your own filters is not difficult. It's a simple JavaScript function. Call it a filter. Boom, I've got a filter. It's really easy. And of course, every client you will talk to will want a different filter, right? Because I want a negative in front of the $sign for negative dollar amounts. No, no, no. This client says I need a negative after the $sign. Why, I don't know what the difference is, but sorting and ordering are performed by using the filter and order by filters. Sounds kind of redundant, right? But literally, one of the filters is a filter. So, here's how we use it. In my expressions, you can see up at the top, line 9 through 12, little curly braces. Right after the property, I use a pipe, put the filter in. Done. That's it. If you need multiple filters, you can separate them by pipes. Any questions? Anyone? We often need to filter our data via search or some such, right? Of course, we're in an SPA, we need to do that client side. If we're going to search through a list of data or something, we're going to do that client side. In other words, we're going to have a grid of data, because a lot of apps need a grid of data, right? You're going to be able to search through them, you're going to use filters. The NGRoute directive provides filtering functionality using this filter, just like this. This basically says, okay, repeat this tr tag, repeat it over this collection, data.legos. Each item we're going to call a Lego, and we're going to filter it with the string Bionicle. This could be very dangerous, because if your Lego has 2 properties in it, no problem. If your Lego item here has 50 properties, this filter is going to look through all 50 properties on each item in your Legos to find anything that says Bionicle, right? And filter it down. So just be wary, right? So that's why we need more advanced ones, right? We can actually pass it an object. So here I created an object for searching. I'm going to say I want the property color to be red and the shape to be square. Put the filter in, and now I've actually narrowed this as a much more complex, quick filter that doesn't look at every property in Lego, just looks at those 2. And we can see it actually at work here. This is very similar to the earlier example. No, I'm not a terribly huge Game of Thrones fan, but it was a perfect list of names that I just saw. I'm like, hey, that'll work. So we put the list of people in, and here I broke out everything under a nice subscope. And we see we're going to order it, so we see multiple things going on here. We've got an order by and the filter going on, so we can do both. And I just spit out a list of all those items, and we can see how quick this actually works. This is only 4 items, so it better work quick. If this is slow, there's a problem. But it actually works pretty quick on a large number of items. But again, listen to the UX guys. You don't want to put a large list of things in a UI. Figure out a way to make it smaller. But it's very quick, easy, nothing with a Z, you're done, right? Which brings us to the next, this is like probably the point that's going to tie into Joomla, right? Because Joomla now has an ability to expose its data on the back end through JSON Rest services, right? In some way. So this is where you're going to be able to use this. In other words, you can use your own app, build a single page app maybe, and still use the same data that's built and run by a CMS tool in the back end, right? So like you have your marketing department's managing what's in there, and then the application actually is showing it. So, IOC and XHR. Anybody know what IOC means? Anyone? Good. At least 2 of you. We got 2 prizes here. There we go. 2 prizes. There we go. All right. I got 4. I got some T-shirts here to give out too for after too. A couple of them. So IOC is an acronym for inversion of control, otherwise known as dependency injection. When you build a large application, there are a few ways that your objects that depend on other objects can get those objects. Inside the object, you can create a new instance of it. But that becomes a problem when things get big. It's hard to test. You can have other things create it and put it in there, door number 2. But door number 3, the best thing is to just say, hey, over here I've got these items. I'm going to put them in a list. Something's going to manage them. Over here I've got an object that says, hey, I need one of those. And the framework automatically takes care of that dependency and injects it. So each Angular app actually has an injector that's a service, basically a service locator to handle this for you. To announce dependencies, we simply add in our function the dependency. We've already seen this. Every time I build a controller so far in the previous examples, there's a $sign scope there. That told Angular, it said, hey, this controller depends on scope. Give it to me. The controller didn't go get it. The controller didn't instantiate it, do anything about it. In fact, the controller has no clue there's a scope out there. All it knows is it says, hey, I need this. Give it to me. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to do my job. Anything with a $sign is a Angular built-in service that can be injected. Singles in service, whatever it is from Angular. Anything without is going to be your own custom service. So somewhere you're going to define the service, and anywhere you need it, you just say, I need it here. And it handles it for you. This is where most people, one of the first things they do when they start building an app, say, hey, I need global variables, because everybody thinks they need global variables. Usually you're going to build something like a service to handle that, and then now you just inject it everywhere you need it, and you're good. I don't know why they chose the $sign. I guess they're nodding to some other library. I don't know. So, $HTTP is the Angular XHR service. It, of course, handles get, post, put, all the good stuff. JSON P requests also can handle. JSON formats are, of course, king, right? Because that's the new world order. If you're not using JSON, well, I'm sorry. You can build your own interceptors and transformers, they call them in the Angular vernacular, to use with those soapy devils. So if you're still stuck having to use SOAP, XML, or RPC type stuff, then you can actually do it. It's painful, but it works. You're probably stuck doing that on every other app anyway, so you're probably used to it. Oh, here's a simple example on doing an XHR request. I have a JSON file that's just local, so it's easy to pull up because I don't want to have a server running. I have an app, a controller, I have a button that says, hey, when you click me, go call this method inside my controller. And after that, I have an engine repeat that, guess what? It's binding to some object, some collection, and does some stuff, spitting it out in color, right? Now, the meat of this is right here. Inside the controller, that little method on the do click says on line 22 there, $HTTP get, right? Which is a simple HTTP get. So it's doing an XHR request, setting it up there. The service allows you to chain methods. So I chain it to a then. So HTTP get, then do this. Anybody know what that's called when you're doing this? Then. They use then, defer, update, cancel. It's the new world order of promises. Promises, promises. I hope that didn't get on video. Instead of passing handlers for asynchronous type things to handle and call back on, callback handlers, which can get really, really unwieldy in a large application, they're now using this idea of promises, which is kind of similar idea, but it moves up the handler bit to a little more abstracted layer. So this is basically saying, run this get. The get here returns a promise. On the promise, I'm going to say then, and I'm going to pass it a function that's a success function, and I will pass it a error function. Goes off, fires it off, your UI goes on, everything's hunky-dory, then when everything comes back from the server, Angular in the promise here that's set up already knows to say, hey, I've got this stuff back. go do this. Nice little anonymous function here. I didn't have to actually build a handler or do anything. It's anonymous function going on. So once it comes back, I stick it in my scope. That's all I have to do, because immediately, because of the two-way binding, my UI gets notified, and the NGRepeat kicks in, and I get my data from the UI, just like that. Pretty quick and easy, right? Any question on that? Getting pretty heavy development code there. So, next up, we're in a single page app. We want users to click things, right? But we don't want the page to reload, right? Normally when you click anything on your web page, your page goes back to the server, does its reload thing, right? So now we need to route things, and we do this creating these crafty little URLs, and we intercept them. But basically, this is nothing new. This is happening in a few different frameworks. There's an interception bit that says, hey, when the user goes and clicks something, and this happened earlier, we saw that A became a directive, the anchor tag. It says when we click on something, just absorb it, don't let the browser do anything with it. We're going to listen for it, handle it, and tell the browser false or whatever, say don't listen to me. How this is done in Angular is we use what's known as NGRoute. There's a couple of examples going on in here. One, it's the first time I'm using Bootstrap, because you got to use it, right? Because you got to put in everything, and default colors and everything. It's like back when I used to be a Flex developer, and when Flex got big and started going everywhere, and you could see all these Flex apps, and they all had the same default green theme. I'm like, hello. And same thing with Bootstrap. All these sites look exactly the same now. They look better, but it's still looking the same. So we have, down on line 15 and 16, we see two anchor tags, right? And in there, we have an href. That when we click that, when the user clicks that, normally that does what? It adds /add new order or /show order to the end of your URL and goes to the server and does its thing. But since we're intercepting them, it's not going to do that. It's actually going to be using this code down here. Here is how we set these things up. For one, it's the first time we build an app. Usually we have a module name. This time we've added an extra argument here. This is telling us to go get some external modules. In the more recent versions of Angular, they've actually separated and moved NGRoute out of the base framework into an external module. This is how, actually, if you were to go out to ngmodules.com, you get all kinds, there's like thousands of modules people out there you get. When you drop it in, you add it to your dependency. And of course, you need to have a JavaScript line or a script tag line to pull it in. But we pull it in, and we're going to configure the route provider. In this case, we're not doing the injection like we did before because it's a provider. Providers are a little different. They actually provide services. They aren't actually the service. So we're going to configure this guy with this little function, simple pattern, and basically says here, when I see this pattern in my URL, I'm going to do this. And when I see this pattern, I do this. Otherwise, I'm going to redirect to something else. So you can handle defaults if somebody clicks something wrong, or maybe you just have a default that's always going to be there in case they mess with the URL, right? Because people mess with URLs. Developers never do that, right? So it has a default there. Now, what is this actually doing? And you see here, this is actually saying, okay, when add new order comes in on the route, I want you to use this template. And I actually have a template, HTML fragment, partial sitting on the hard drive or whatever. And I want you to wire that template up to this controller. So this is telling you that when you set up your routes here, every route you can have its own template and its own controller on it to handle that section. So if there's a new order piece, like here in the example of show orders, we're going to list the orders out maybe. Add order, we're going to show add order form, and the controller in there is going to be able to handle what? Adding a new order, validating input, calling XHR, all that kind of stuff, right? So what does Angular do with this template and controller once you've said this? Because nothing here says to do anything, right? Where does it go? We can see a very simple, highly competitive UX site here I got. There's a header, a footer, there's our buttons, and I think when I look at the example later running because of the screen size, it's changed something. The show orders is right here in the middle. Where's that at? You look up here on line 19, we see an element called ngView. Angular knows that when you put an ngView, or one of them there, and you set up your routes, that's where it puts this stuff. Right? So you can have all your header, all your navigation around on a single app and handle all your routes in one area. Every time a new template comes in, right where that ngView is, rip out what's there, inject the new stuff, wire up the controller, you're good to go. And we can actually see this being clicked. And you can see that when I click on there, there's a little pound up there that gets added in, and there's no little refresh circle thing going on, right? Indicating that the page is loading. Of course, that could get pretty hairy if you're going to have a lot of routes, and as soon as you have more than 2 or 3, you're going to talk about sub-routes and sub-routes on that, and inheriting all those. That's why they have on NG modules, they have a UI router, which is a plugin replacement for this that can get much more complex than what Angular provides. But that's routing pretty quick and simple. Again, you can have a pretty complex app. I mean, you have a 10-stage form where normally it would have been multiple pages, taking time to go back to the server and come back, and you're having drop-off rates because people are leaving. Now I have a single-page app that just immediately goes to it right away. I get it. The user can start seeing what I need, and maybe I need some Ajax calls are going in to do some validation here and there while they're starting to fill things out and can go back and forth. And speaking of back and forth, it manages the history on your browser. So each time I click that, it added a history element. So if I use the back and forward button, it manages it right there. It's right in there. So it can handle that. So the user pushes the back button, you don't suddenly go back to the Google site where they try to find you and lose everything they were doing. How much time I got left up there anyways? Like 4:30? So forms. As we mentioned earlier, Angular boards the form controls, adds some stuff to it. It makes heavy use of the two-way data binding. They add some directives that you're going to be able to use within forms, ng disabled, ng show, ng click. You can imagine ng disabled, pass it a Boolean. So in your model somewhere you're going to have, hey, if they check this box, I need this form, subform enabled, where you use ng enable to control that. Real simple and easy. There's a smattering of directives that actually inject classes. Most all of them do. Angular is very big on this and using classes to modify behavior at runtime. Some of these are ng invalid, ng valid, ng pristine, ng dirty. For starters, these are used. So imagine in a form, you have a form and the user, when it first starts up, the user hasn't touched it yet, it's in its pristine state. Those form elements will actually have class equal ng pristine on them. As soon as they put some element, in one of those elements that puts something in there or change a checkbox or something, it immediately can become ng dirty. The ng pristine class is removed from those elements, dirty is added. If its validation kicked in right away, then it would have both invalid and dirty or valid and dirty. Until they do a reset, you do a hard reset on the whole form, nothing becomes pristine again. They also give some directives for filtering your input. So you have patterns, max, min lengths, whether it's required or not. And it's ng required, so then you can pass it a Boolean from your model to say, hey, again, just like the hide display or disable, you can say, guess what? They check this box, they're required to put an email. And you just simply use ng required for that. So here's an ugly looking form in very small type. It's really good for you to see all the way in the back probably. I didn't know exactly how big the screen was until I got here today. Let's see if I can actually. It might look a little better, but I can't get as much on the screen. Nope. Pardon? The app I'm using? Sublime Text, yeah. Yep. Yeah, if you're all the script kiddies are using Sublime Text to do any kind of work these days, so I would definitely suggest using it. Yeah, I don't think that's really going to get too much better because that screen's just not as modern as this place is. They still have VGA connections. So it's an 800 by 600 screen. It's amazing. So it looks really ugly, but basically it's using everything we just talked about. And we have a lot of the double binding going on in that. Let's just kind of jump down to this one here so it's easier to point at and get to. We have a class setting. We're not actually using the ng invalid classes in this case. You could use them, but in this case it didn't. It's pretty flexible. But here I basically said, you know what? Add has error if the user form, the email part, is invalid or pristine. And you notice there's a $sign in front of it, which is part of that orging process earlier. Actually, on the individual form, the form is called up here, the form.email, right? User form.email gets to our input email, and they've added the $sign invalid, $sign pristine onto that. That's extended the HTML. Normally that's not there. But we actually listen to that, so as soon as the model says, hey, I'm invalid or I'm pristine, I'm going to add the has error class in, right? And it'll actually inject it to the list of classes. So if you already had 6 class elements in your class attribute, it'll just add it to the end and we'll pull it out when it needs to. And once I do that, the class error shows up. It changes what it looks like, so I get some behavior. Also, I have an ng show here that basically says, hey, show this p tag only when it's invalid and not pristine. So when the user's typing away and they put in an invalid email, as soon as they do, immediately it'll show an error, which may not be the best UX, but it's great for an example. You can actually see it working here a little faster. So username too short and go back and forth trying to get to it, because in better UX actually would say what your username needs to be between this and that, but this is just a good example of getting it in there. And all this while, the whole time, the submit won't work until I actually have some valid data in there, and then it will force submit. If I had a little more time, I could switch over to the browser, and you can actually see in the element, in the inspector tools and the elements, you can actually see all the classes and stuff being pulled out and put back in by Angular on the fly when things are invalid and whatnot. So that's pretty much the bulk of everything we covered today. Got a list of resources on a slide, and these slides are going to be available, I guess, on SlideShare later or wherever the conference runner Steve's going to put them. Our biggest resource, of course, is AngularJS.org. Head out there. They've got all the docs, all the information, issues, things. Their documentation used to be horrid. Because guess who built it all? Developers, exactly. So it's bad, right? They've gotten much better at that. The documentation is really, really much better now. You really can't complain too much on it. It has a tutorial out there you can run through that is probably one of the slickest ways to do tutorial I've seen, and maybe it's becoming popular now, but I haven't seen anybody else do this. The tutorial is literally a GitHub project, and at each step in the tutorial, you basically just you pull a new branch or tag from the GitHub project, and it just shows you the source at that point until you get all the way to the end. It's pretty cool. So you get to get a little practice with Git at the same time of learning Angular. It's kind of neat. Once you move past that a little bit, I'd suggest hitting egghead.io. This is a site run by John Lindquist. Anybody ever heard this guy's name on the web? Pretty big guy. He works for JetBrains. Hope you've heard of JetBrains, right? You guys, some of you are doing PHP stuff, right? So WebStorm, right? They build WebStorm. They also build IntelliJ, Angular Studio, and a smattering of other terms, tools. I think PyStorm and some Apple thing, iOS developer tool. So he has built a whole bunch of videos of him building pieces of Angular stuff that you can just go out and watch. I mean, it's like put on a pot of coffee, sit there for a weekend, and you can watch them all. He's working now with Joel Hooks, the name behind after that, who's a coworker of mine who blogs a lot on that, joelhooks.com, about Angular applications and building them. He is working with Egghead.io now to help with the content there and push those things out pretty good. They may actually start charging teams and stuff for that. NGConf was a conference that just recently occurred in Salt Lake City back in January, I think. It was the first Angular conference. They were expecting, I think, a few hundred people. They ended up having like almost 1,000 people show up. And it's pretty big. They have everything that was done at that conference is on video there. So there's a lot of great talks, and go out and check that out. The difference being the conference there was a little different in setup in that it was one large room, and all the sessions were in that room. And the sessions ran anywhere from 15 minutes to like 45 minutes. Depending on who you were and what the topic was, they changed the time. It's pretty amazing. A little good stuff there. And like I mentioned before, ngmodules.org, once you start building an app, you're going to need something that isn't built into it. Go out there. It's like a library source, right? You can find modules that do other things that you want that you haven't done. They have, of course, the UI router I mentioned earlier. You also have a Bootstrap module, so you can actually have directives that do your Bootstrap CSS stuff. So they've actually converted a lot of stuff into actual directive. So it puts it into the framework, the Angular way of doing things. And that's usually the JavaScript part of the Bootstrap, right? And a few other things there you can go check out when you get a moment. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for coming. All of you way back there. Hope it's helpful.